Quick question. How many times have you seen a science fiction show, book, or other work of media that whips out a sword and they start swashbuckling, even though they live in a setting where guns exist? One of the biggest offenders has to be the Dune franchise, which justifies the use of swords with their high-velocity shields that block bullets but not melee weapons. Okay, so how come light can get in and out of those shields? Why can't they make a shield that works on melee weapons as well? Why does sound get through? Why make a shield that only works at a really specific velocity range? This is one of those cases where you're not supposed to ask questions, just go with it. Frank Herbert wanted swords in his sci-fi novel, and he made the shields to justify the weapons, not the other way around. And if you know anything about me, you know that I can't stand that kind of world building. Or really a lack of world building. So the big question is, why would anyone use melee weapons when they live in a world where guns exist? And I think making up some kind of bullcrap equipment that only blocks range weapons should be your last resort. First, let's take a look at why people still use melee weapons today. Even in the United States, arguably the most advanced military in the world, combat knives are standard equipment for the Marines. And it should be obvious why. You don't just use them for combat, they're also used as a basic cutting tool for everything from ropes to zip ties. Then there's the trench shovel. People have been using that as an improvised weapon since the First World War, sometimes preferring that over the knife because of the longer reach. There's also the machete, which is almost a sword in its own right, and is favored throughout Africa in part for its utility in cutting through underbrush, while also being an effective weapon. And of course, people actually use these things as weapons in the real world today, in a world where guns exist. Now, the first reason a US Marine would bring a knife to a gunfight is because sometimes the other guy has a knife, or a similar melee weapon. The thing about firearms is, unless it's something like a shotgun or a pistol, which are designed to be used at close range, they're not easy to use in hand-to-hand combat. A rifle is really difficult to aim in close quarters, and if you're in an indoor environment with not a lot of room to aim or maneuver, you don't want to be the guy holding an unwieldy rifle while the other guy is charging at you with a knife. You might be able to clip him with a bullet or two, but there's a reason why cops empty their clips when they shoot at a suspect that's charging at them. Bullets are not instant death projectiles with infinite stopping power, and very often the last thing in the suspect's hands goes to the grave with him. Basically, when you're dying and your brain knows it, all of the safety restraints that your brain normally keeps on your muscles to prevent you from permanently injuring yourself get released because there's no point anymore. So if you only manage to wound the guy that's charging at you, there's a very real chance that he'll kill you before he bleeds out, unless you can do something to fend him off in hand-to-hand. This, incidentally, is why the basic equipment for your average police officer in most Western countries is a pistol, rather than a rifle, because in most nations, the criminals are not going to be armed with anything other than a knife or an improvised melee weapon. That brings me to the second reason why people still use melee weapons today. Because guns aren't always widely available, even if you live in a society that's advanced enough to have them. Maybe your characters live in a society where gun rights aren't extended to the common citizens, so whenever a rebellion forms, they can't reliably arm themselves with anything more substantial than common tools, knives, household implements. An important thing to remember about melee weapons: they're easy to make and maintain. Even in the case when you got some sort of high-tech version of a melee weapon, which we'll get into in a bit, they're not likely to require as much maintenance or difficulty to produce as their ranged equivalents. This would especially come into play when you're talking about a sci-fi setting where not every person lives in the same community with the same level of technology. This could be a future version of Earth where different settlements have different manufacturing capacities, kind of like Africa versus the United States today. Or a space opera where some planets can make high-tech guns and other backwater planets have to work with whatever they've got. And if your government or other authorities know that criminals and rebels are mostly going to be armed with knives and clubs, they're going to outfit their enforcers with some form of melee weapons of their own, possibly higher tech weapons than whatever the rebels have got. And it's not just about making the weapons, you also have to be able to maintain them. And in the case of firearms, you need to keep them supplied with ammunition. In Warhammer 40k, this is actually the reason why the Astra Militarum are all armed with lasguns. I remember when these guys showed up in Dawn of War, Winter Assault, and the background fluff said that these were just enough of a gun to say that the guardsmen were armed, but they were pitiful in terms of actual firepower. So why are these the mainline weapon of the Imperium? Well, it's because they use a solar-powered battery for ammunition, which is easy to recharge. Sure, a bolt gun is basically an automatic grenade launcher. Yeah, a plasma gun is a way better choice for fighting a traitor Astartes. Even an autogun, which is really just a modern rifle in 40k, has the benefit of leaving solid projectiles in the target that can become a problem for things like Tyranids, who can heal rapidly. But where are you going to get ammo for those things? How do you keep your entire military supplied? You might get one clip out of your bolter, and then you'd better affix those bayonets. Battletech is another franchise that handles this subject fairly well. One of the reasons why the Inner Sphere starts making lots of mechs with melee weapons is because they start running out of actual guns, and they lose the ability to manufacture the older toys over time. Putting a big stick on a mech becomes a lot more common as the succession wars go on. And one last reason why people keep using melee weapons in the modern world has to do with armor. Now, this is going to sound hypocritical given how I started this video making fun of Dune's low velocity shields, but bear with me. In real life, Kevlar is notoriously bad at stopping knives, particularly stab wounds. Unlike the low-velocity shields, the reason for this has to do with the fact that Kevlar is a woven material made of fibers that can be separated by the focused pressure of a knife stab. And yes, the fact that the knife is moving slow enough for the focused pressure to separate the Kevlar fibers is part of the reason why knives can get through a vest. But there are two things to take into account. One, unlike the low-velocity shielding, Kevlar being a woven material doesn't involve anything all that ridiculous in terms of technology. It largely just comes down to the way the material fibers are woven together. And second, it's really common to reinforce Kevlar with a layer of plates made of steel, titanium, or ceramics. In other words, no one asks in real life why soldiers wearing Kevlar don't just wear something to block melee attacks, because they already do. All without setting off a chain of questions about the bullcrap shields of Dune, like, why don't those shields block light and make you invisible? If they only block things at certain velocities, why can't you make one that blocks weapons moving at a lower velocity? And what about primitive range weapons that are slower than a bullet? I think Stargate once dealt with this where Apophis had a velocity shield and they tried to shoot him with a bow and arrow. But there's other issues with armor. And by that, I mean regular, thick-armored vehicles, and maybe power-armored soldiers. Once again, Warhammer 40k does a great job of exploring options with these tropes. Lots of anti-armor weapons are widely available for infantry in the 41st millennium, but they all have pros and cons. Las cannons, for example, are usually pretty accurate, excellent anti-tank weapons, and fairly reliable, but they burn through an entire power charge in a single shot, which makes carrying ammunition difficult and they're usually pretty slow to fire. They're also among the heaviest weapons the Imperium has, and normal humans usually have to fire them from a turret. Missile and rocket launchers are easy to maintain and can shoot a variety of payloads, but they aren't very accurate, and they're almost as heavy as las cannons, and their ammo is just as heavy. Plasma guns are really effective against armor, especially armored infantry, and even standard foot soldiers can carry the standard model because they don't weigh as much as a rocket launcher. But they come with the incredible drawback of producing so much heat that there's a good chance they'll kill the guy firing it along with the target, all in addition to being less accurate than a las cannon. And then we have meltaguns, also called a fusion gun. These have the advantage of being reasonably accurate, high damaging, anti-armor weapons held like a standard rifle, but they have one major problem. They have really short range. Battletech handles this in a similar way. In Battletech, most energy weapons don't really do enough damage to get through an assault mech, unless you go with something like a PPC. And even then, you usually need more than one of them, and they generate so much heat that you can't fire them recklessly or you'll shut down. Missile weapons are more for dealing with smaller, fast-moving targets, and are like gnats to an assault class mech. Ballistic weapons come with a variety of trade-offs. Generally, the higher the caliber of an autocannon, the more damage, but the shorter the range. They're also heavier, and unlike energy weapons, they use ammunition to fire, which adds more weight to the mech, will run out during long engagements, and can explode if the enemy scores a critical hit. A Gauss rifle solves all these problems with a high-damage, long-range shot that produces very little heat, but they weigh so much that only heavier class mechs can carry them, and the few exceptions to that can carry a Gauss rifle and not much else. This largely reflects anti-armor weapons in real life. Anything will break if you hit it with enough force, but a lot of armor is designed to redirect or nullify some of that force. This is why armor on a tank is often sloped, because if a shell from a cannon doesn't hit it at exactly the right angle, it could bounce right off. Often the solution is to make a much bigger gun and mount it on another vehicle, but that's not always a viable solution if you're a foot soldier. Other solutions for dealing with tanks are often to throw some kind of anti-tank grenades at the enemy vehicle, but those are usually in limited supply, and they don't always work as well against power-armored soldiers. So what do you do if you're fighting an enemy that's in a walking tin can? You bring a can opener. This is where I see some of the best examples of high-tech melee weapons in science fiction, where it's not just, I want to see laser swords in space, but rather, I've got to give my characters a weapon that can realistically get through their enemy's power armor. Why do so many space marines carry power swords? This is why. Even the chainsword needs special mention because while it isn't as effective against an enemy in armor, it is effective against the thick muscles of an orc or the carapace of a tyrannid. Meanwhile, in Battletech, mounting a melee weapon on a mech becomes an alternative solution to a lot of the problems with other weapons that I mentioned earlier. A mech with an axe on one arm has a weapon that can deal a lot of damage, doesn't need ammo, generates no heat, and is relatively cheap to produce and maintain. The only trade-off is that it has an incredibly short range. Now, that about covers all the reasons why people still use melee weapons today, and how they can be extended to a science fiction setting. But we're not quite done. There's one reason to use a melee weapon in a sci-fi setting that we don't have to deal with in real life. Let's say that you have warriors who have to fight on a planet that doesn't have an atmosphere. Maybe they have spacesuits that protect them and keep them alive, but there's no air or anything like that. Do you know why they're called firearms? It's because they rely on combustion to propel the bullet. You know what you need for fire that you don't have in a vacuum? Yeah, air. That stuff. Of course, you can get around this by encasing the gun in some kind of casing, like a spacesuit for your rifle. That might work. But there's another problem. Where is the heat from the weapon gonna go? In real life, rifles often have lots of cooling units that work by transferring heat from the weapon into the surrounding air. You don't have anything like that in space, so the only place for the heat to go is into the hands of the person holding it. Now, if you can build your Marine a suit that can protect him from the harsh environment of outer space, it's not unreasonable to think that you can put some kind of thermal shielding on their hands to protect them from the heat. But all that's really going to do is keep the heat from going out of the rifle, meaning it stays in the gun, which means the gun is going to overheat really fast. This is a problem that real-life militaries worry about today, when we have this fancy thing called air to keep things cool. How many shots are you going to get in space before your gun explodes in your hands from the heat setting off all of your remaining ammunition? A laser, or a high-tech weapon, might get around some of these issues, but the more problems you hand-wave with higher levels of tech, the more likely the gun would be really expensive and hard to produce. So, what kind of weapon can you use in a vacuum that doesn't generate heat? Generally, something that doesn't have a lot of moving parts. What kind of weapon doesn't have any of those? Oh right, melee weapons. Other options like rocket launchers might work, or something that can eject a cooling rod full of heat, but I'm pretty sure you can see the ways that those are limited. Remember, if I've got a sword, and I put a hole in your spacesuit, even if I don't hit anything vital on you, you could be dead very quickly. A skin-tight spacesuit would prevent this to an extent, because your skin would get sucked into the hole and you'd just get a really bad hickey, which is why people are actually working on skin-tight suits in real life. But if I put a hole in your oxygen tank, you get the idea. And this isn't just for foot soldiers on the ground, either. Realistically, a fight in space between two Gundams or something similar would play out as two guys in massive suits of samurai armor dueling exclusively with katanas. So to wrap up, there are plenty of ways to make melee weapons work in a sci-fi setting. The more you think about it, the harder it is to imagine a futuristic setting that doesn't have swords and hammers. But please, put a little effort into the world building for it. Don't make your audience sit there wondering why they don't just use their guns. Now, I know that at the time this video is being released, the new Fantastic Four movie is coming out. And I bring this up because my brother-in-law mentioned that he was looking forward to it because he thinks this is the last hope for Marvel movies, on the grounds that it couldn't be as bad as the last time they made a Fantastic Four movie. To me, this is like saying that you're looking forward to what looks like the cinematic equivalent of diarrhea soup, because it can't be as bad as the last bowl of diarrhea soup you were served by a chef that openly states he wants to feed you diarrhea soup. This actually made me really upset. Not angry, just depressed, because it means my brother-in-law is actually excited about something that he knows is going to be bad. Not like a content creator who makes a living making fun of garbage media like The Critical Drinker, and not in a let's go make fun of a bad movie kind of way either. He's genuinely hoping to go appreciate a movie that he knows is going to be bad because he's been living on a media diet of so much garbage slop that he thinks that the new Fantastic movie looks like it might be a high point on the roller coaster. Meanwhile, another one of my friends told me that the thing they like most about my videos is that they help him explain to people why some media is great and some media is crap. And while I'm more than happy to yap about whatever comes to my mind, and I have a backlog of topics that I still want to get to, I'm curious if there are any subjects that you guys want discussed that you don't think are being covered elsewhere. I make no promises, and this will still only be covering things that are related to writing, world building, and similar topics, but if there is something that you want me to discuss, let me know in the comments below. I'm not promising I will do a video on it, but if you have earnest questions on how to make better stories, it never hurts to ask. And finally, today's featured video game is Moonlighter 2. I absolutely loved the first Moonlighter, which is a roguelike where you play as a merchant who dives into dungeons, gathers relics, and sells them in a family shop called the Moonlighter. Not only is the gameplay fun, both in the dungeon and the process of running your store, but the story, including the hidden origin of the dungeons, is excellent. Moonlighter 2 has changed the formula somewhat. Not only does the story so far leave more questions than answers, but they've gone from a 2D top-down hack-and-slash to a 3D isometric system. Meanwhile, they've radically changed how the merchant part of the game works. Instead of having to guess at how much to charge for the items that you find, there's just a base value that artifacts have, and you always have ways of raising the price through your charm and boosters. I haven't made up my mind about these changes. On one hand, they take some of the challenge out of being a shopkeeper. On the other hand, I can see why it would frustrate some new players when you find some one-of-a-kind item from a boss fight and you don't know how much to sell it for. If you've never tried the original Moonlighter, I do recommend playing it before playing Moonlighter 2. You don't have to, but I can give the first game my unabridged stamp of approval. This new game isn't bad, I just can't make up my mind on whether it's as good as the first. It's still worth checking out though, and at the time of recording this video, there's a demo on Steam, so try it before you buy it. Alright, that's all I have for today. Hit that like and subscribe button, and thank you all, and goodbye.